What is up, everybody? Welcome to Unity 2018. It's been out for a while, and Unity has just recently released their Book of the Dead demo that you may have seen for free, and you can get it on the asset store now. It is free. It's been out for about a month. But today, what I'm going to do is kind of show you guys the project. We're going to walk around it a little bit, and we're going to try to see how Unity has done it. We're going to see the layers that they use through post-processing, terrain, and megascans, and then their own assets to kind of see how they achieved what they got and see what you guys can do in Unity now. So for this project to work, you're going to need Unity 2018.2.0b9. This is the minimum version you need to run the project. Also, guys, make sure if you're going to use the Book of the Dead project, you're going to need to import it into an empty project. You cannot import it into a project that you have been working on unless you know what's going to happen, because a lot of your scene settings, your project settings, such as your player settings, and some of your other data is going to get changed from what it currently is. So make sure you guys import it into a brand new project. So what I've noticed in Unity 2018 is all of our windows are now inside of these little pullouts inside of your window. So to get to the asset store, we're going to go to General, Asset Store. Alright guys, so here's the asset on the asset store, and when you import it, it's about 2.4 gigabytes, so give it time once you download it for the first time. Go get some coffee, grab a snack, do something, because it's going to take a while to import. But I'm going to go ahead and import it into a new project, and I'll be right back. Alright guys, we got the Book of the Dead environment imported into our new project here, and we are going to go ahead and get started. So to actually load up the environment, what we're going to want to do is go under Tools, and there's a handy little button right here that says Load Book of the Dead Environment. Alright, so now we got the scene loaded up, and one thing that I'm going to do to help break down this scene before we really get started is I'm actually going to duplicate our environment scene. Now, I think since Unity 2017, we've been able to combine scenes together, and what Unity has done is they've put audio zones, all the sounds, some of these collisions, and looks like this master controller, which I think has to do with once you build a project, a little window that says it's loading your project, like loading the assets. We don't really need that in this case. We just need the actual environment. So what we're going to do is I'm going to right click and click Save Scene As. I'm going to save it as tutorial, and this is just going to let me duplicate it so I can open it up without messing up the original scene, just in case we want to go back to it. Alright, so let's go ahead and open up our new scene that we just duplicated, and it's the exact same except we don't have those audio sources, we don't have any sounds, we don't have that UI scene, and then we don't have the collisions. All this is just the environment. So I just want to mention, I'm not an environment artist. I'm not necessarily a professional when it comes to looking at Unity or programming per se, but I've had some time to mess around with the scene just a little bit, and this is also going to be a learning experience for me. But what I hope to get out of this is hopefully some of you guys can be able to see how Unity created this project, this environment, see the different elements that we have, and kind of see how they pieced it together. So what you'll notice is we already got image effects applied in our scene view. If we jump over to the game view, we can see that those same image effects are of course applied, and we can disable them if we click this button up here that lets us toggle. But as you can see, our scene is very dark, and that has to do a lot with how Unity is using the HD render pipeline and the new post-processing effects. So the first thing I want to do is kind of talk about the post-processing, because what a lot of people will forget or take for granted is just how much post-processing is helping the scene, because once we disable some of the effects, you'll really start to see how the scene is changing. One thing that you'll notice in the demo is as you move your character around or you move the camera around, the light will change, the post-processing will kind of change. And I don't really care about that. I kind of just want the default lighting in the scene. So this will kind of take away some of the post-processing effects, which what I'm about to do, but I'm hopefully going to simplify the scene a little bit, just kind of delete things that we don't exactly need. So if we go to scene settings and we pull this out and we go under area settings, this is where we have all these different post-processing volume. That's what PPV is. And I think AV is atmospheric volume, I'm assuming. we only want the default ones, so we can take the first encounter all the way to the wind glade and even the cliff ones. And before we delete it, we can just kind of toggle it, and you can kind of see how our environment is changing. Before, it's kind of this green color. And once we disable it, you can see how it kind of makes it less. And one of the reasons I wanted to delete it is because we have these big volume spheres here, and that's what we see in the scene view to kind of see what the camera is, how the camera is changing our post-processing as we pass through it. So we're just going to delete those because, again, it's just a little bit more post-processing just depending on where the character's camera is. And as you can see, we still have a lot of our atmospheric scattering, our God rays, or volumetric lighting, whatever you want to call it, our ambient occlusion, our grain, and all of that. So now let's get back to the post-processing. Everything as far as post-processing in our scene is under this default PPV now. And if you disable it, you can see our scene goes back to that really dark, and we still have some atmospheric scattering, and that's under something different. But we're just going to start looking at the post-processing. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is disable everything except for the auto exposure. And this is going to show you just how much the post-processing really helps this scene. So once I disable everything, you can see we don't have much left. And in fact, let me go ahead and disable our atmospheric scattering, which is under here. So as you can see, there is still a bunch of elements that really bring, you know, sort of a natural element to how these layers in our project is stacked. So it's really exciting to see how, even though we don't have any post-processing, everything just kind of works together really well. And a lot of that actually comes from the new occlusion area. And we can see that under our occlusion probes and our grass occlusion. And the most important one is our occlusion probes. So if we disable that, you can see, wow, it changes a lot in our scene. But I'm going to leave that on for now. So as you can see, the post-processing really ties this scene together. If I go ahead and let me just toggle everything back on. There's really only two that I'm going to leave on for the purposes of right now, and that is going to be our auto exposure and then ambient occlusion. And the ambient occlusion really helps to, you know, obscure a lot of the color data and just the scene that's all hidden by our geometry. So if we turn that off, you can see it's sort of bringing out the shadows, you know, areas like this corner down here where this tree branch really sticks out. And especially if we go over here on this rock, you can see there's a lot of shadows here that we don't get without the ambient occlusion effect. So as far as post-processing, that's what we really have. And we also have anti-aliasing, which we don't worry about in our project settings anymore. Usually you'd go to graphics or quality, your quality settings, to change anti-aliasing, but it's not under here anymore. And the reason why it's not is because it's actually on our camera. So if we expand gameplay, come down here to our main camera, you can see it's on this post-process layer right here, anti-alias mode. And if we set it to none, it doesn't change our scene view until we put it back to fast approximate anti-aliasing. And for as far as this video goes, I'm just going to leave it off because I think we get a lot sharper images with it off in our scene view, and that's where we're going to spend most of our time. Alright, so now let's start tearing the scene apart. The first thing I want to do is sort of look at the terrain and see what Unity has done with the terrain. So everything in our scene is going to be under our environment here. Whoa, it gets really laggy once we click on that. So another thing I would watch out for is try to stay away from wireframe mode because you're going to drop frame rates, and it takes a while to switch between wireframe and shaded. So if we expand environment and go to terrain, we can see our terrain is here under terrain. So we're going to disable the props and the backdrop. And as far as this video goes, the backdrop doesn't really matter. It's going to be some buildings way out, or some foliage and some cliffs that are way out in the distance, but none of that really matters right now. Alright, so what we got here is a bunch of grass, which you can probably assume is part of our terrain if we go under trees. You can see just how many different trees and shrubs and pieces of grass that we're using to add grass to our scene. So not a lot of it is actually placed as a prefab. A lot of this is actually put on the terrain. So I'm going to kind of focus on this area over here because we got a lot of stuff going on with the props once we start adding the rocks and the trees and other things back in. So what you can notice is a lot of the grass is a mixture of these sort of clovers, some thick bladed grass, and we also got some short trees. One thing that I will point out is a lot of these trees can get kind of tall, but a majority of the taller trees that you'll see are the actual props. And one thing that's interesting is these trees, once we place them with the tree painting tool, they will still have the collision bounds that we have on our prefabs, because these prefabs actually have capsule colliders on them. Another thing I want to point out with the terrain is if we kind of look down in this area, you can see how a lot of the shadowing is working on our grass. So if we look kind of down in this area, you can kind of see how a lot of the grass and the clovers and all of our shrubs are kind of shaded. And this actually is not our shadows, this is our occlusions. And if we go back to our occlusion probes here, we can see how it turns sort of this cartoony, all these really bright colors, and it really dials them back. And that does a lot to our realism. And these occlusion probes are not available right now in Unity 2018. And like most of the features in this project, a lot of them are experimental. A lot of them were made just for this project, just to kind of show you what Unity 2018 can do when we kind of push it. And so these occlusion probes kind of work in conjunction with our occlusion area and our occlusion view area, which I think, as far as I know, the occlusion area is just a box that we can see. Yeah, it's this big green box. It's kind of, here's the bounds on it. I don't know if you can really see that. And yeah, the terrain's really kind of glitching out. But let's zoom back into this area. And let's keep working. So what you may have noticed is a lot of the detail does not come from our terrain, because as you can see over here, look, there's a very basic terrain. Obviously they use the circle tool on the paint here to get, you know, a mountain coming up. This is not actually in the view. This is obscured by a mountain. But as you can see, a lot of the terrain is very simple. This is not something that was put a lot of time in. A lot of it actually comes from our models and the grass that occludes and hides a lot of the, you know, how simple the terrain is. So that's something that kind of caught me off guard, was how simple the terrain is. Another thing you'll probably notice is the attention to detail on the textures. You see the textures are kind of sharp here. There's sharp corners. The terrain doesn't really ever, the textures don't ever really fade as much as you think they would. There's a lot of detail in the actual textures, but as far as tiling goes and painting, you can notice that they didn't spend, like, a lot of time wasn't put into making it look really high detailed or faded or blending really nice. Alright, so we kind of looked at the terrain a little bit, but we can't really see a lot of it, so what I'm going to do is kind of erase some of our trees just so we can kind of see what is below. Alrighty, so this is what our terrain looks like without a majority of the trees. I just kind of, you know, shift-clicked to erase a lot of the trees. And as you can see, like I was saying, a lot of the grass is just very basic. There's not a lot to it. The terrain is very simple. A lot of the time was put into actually how our assets were placed. And as you'll notice, if I Control Z, you can see a lot of the grass is placed very strategically too. It's kind of random almost. If we come over to this area, you can see where we have a lot of the trees over here. And if we erase them, you can see a lot of the occlusion comes from it too. So there's a lot of occlusion back in here, and it kind of helps blend the trees together, especially over here as well. So if we kind of erase that and bring it back. Alrighty, so we kind of looked at the terrain. Let's move to the actual props here. And all of our models are placed under this props folder. So let's kind of look at them piece by piece. So if we zoom out a lot, and we enable our trees, you can see a lot of the trees are really tall, and that's where a majority of our height in the scene comes from. So if we get sort of to the player level and we look up, a lot of the height comes from the props that are placed as trees. And a lot of them are these special ones that kind of have a rock growing on top of it, or this one over here, which is on its side and there's a rock that goes on it, and this one that's fallen over, and a lot of these kind of crooked ones. So the trees as props kind of help to hide some of the detail that is not in our terrain. So the terrain's kind of simple, and if we hide the trees, we can see how there's just a big open area, but once we add the trees, a lot of that is, a lot of the background at least is obscured. If we kind of look over here, we can kind of see that too, how it just fills in a lot of the areas back here. And let's kind of work our way down to where the hive is. And we can see this tree that kind of stretches across is there too. A lot of the trees back here. A lot of that. So it's about, I'm going to say it's about 50-50 in terms of trees that are placed with terrain and trees that are placed as props. Alrighty, so the next one is the hive, but we're not going to worry about that because it's just this big structure down here, and that doesn't really have to play into the environment other than, you know, it's just something interesting back there. So the next thing we're going to look at is the Uber tree spawner. And this is some more vegetation that is placed besides the vegetation down here. And if we go ahead and enable that, you can see, especially in this area, a lot of it is these twigs. So if we hide it and enable it, we can kind of see how it's going to cover up a lot of the ground. And that's also going to help to break up a lot of the tiling that we get from the terrain. And it's just another layer that is added on top of our grass here. Especially in this area, what we have on the very bottom level is our terrain textures. Next we have these twigs from the Uber tree spawner, and on top of that we have some of this foliage on the terrain that is popping out. And so all these layers kind of help blend in together, and a lot of that really helps to break up the tiling that we have in textures and sort of the repetition that we get if we're painting with foliage. If we kind of zoom out, you can kind of see that here in these clovers that are kind of placed on the ground. It's kind of, it may be kind of hard to see, but the twigs kind of help break that up. Other than that, the Uber tree spawner isn't really placed much more throughout the scene. There's a couple trees like this one back over here, some more back here, and it looks like there's some more twigs on the ground. And these twigs, if we look at them, these are actually textures. So let me kind of go back over here and click on one of them and go down into our mesh here. We can see that it is actually just an image. If we pull up twigs, you can see it's just a photo scanned asset that was probably used in something like Agisoft photo scan or something like that to create these textures and put them in the scene. So these aren't actually polygons. I mean, it is, but it's like a quad, so we're not worried about polygons as far as the twigs are concerned. So that's some of the other elements that we have layered in the scene to help break up the tiling of the terrain and just add a little bit more interesting detail. But let's go on to vegetation, and let's see what that does. So one thing I want to point out with the vegetation is this area right over here. As you can see, there's a lot of the terrain that is shown, and it doesn't have a lot of detail. That's the thing that I pointed out earlier, is there's not a lot of detail in the terrain. So when we add this vegetation, you can see a lot of that is broken up with these shrubs and these really bushy dead plants. If we kind of walk through them, let's just kind of look at them. So if we kind of scroll through our elements here, we can see a lot of this is these bushes, which all of these assets have LOD levels, and we can kind of visualize that. If we kind of zoom out here, we can see how they start disappearing and they get cold and kind of break up. So one of the key elements here is how these assets are placed to sort of hide a lot of the lack of quality and resolution that we have in our terrain. So that's where I think this vegetation also plays a role, where it wasn't necessarily used in our terrain tree placement, but it was placed as individual assets. And what that helps you do is it helps give you a little bit more control, because if you use the terrain, you can't rotate your meshes. If we come down here and we select this tree, for example, or this little bush, we have all the freedom to take it and rotate it and play with it. Same with like these bushes over here. And as well as like if we come back over here, some of them are placed where these rocks are going to appear. And a lot of this you can't place because, as you can see, this is not on the terrain. This is going to be where we have geometry. So that's where it comes in really handy to be able to place these assets on the terrain, as well as be able to pull them in as prefabs and position them how you need them to be. So with our vegetation here, you'll notice that we have a bunch of variety. So let me kind of toggle between no vegetation and adding it. And you can see we have a bunch of variety. We have these shrubs here, but we also have these sort of reddish colored shrubs, and then these dead ones. And once we intermingle them, you can kind of see how it's going to add us a lot of variation to our scene. And one thing that I find kind of interesting, the way they place this, is a lot of these shrubs are kind of, the red ones are placed in between our dead ones, but sort of these thicker, fuller ones are sort of placed on the outside here. Alrighty, so that's some more of the vegetation. Let's look at some of the other elements that are added into our props. So if we toggle misc, we can see a lot of these assets are dead and fallen tree branches, and like this one right here, that's just a stump. Some more back here. This one's kind of broken up. This one's broken right here. And you can see as we get really close, a lot of the detail comes in through these detail maps that we have on our shaders. So if we pull down our LOD 0, we can pull up our model here, and we can see that a lot of this masking and our normal map really helps to play a role in letting some of that detail come out. What's kind of frustrating is this is actually so far away from your player, we can't actually get this far in the game. But it has so much detail that is included in sort of these models that you don't really necessarily see from the player's perspective. So again, a lot of these misc items are sort of these fallen tree branches in this area. And we can see more if we come back over here. Here's another one that's kind of coming off this rock, and I think that's included in this. Yeah. There's some more branches falling over here, and this isn't any of the rocks, keep that in mind. Here's a tree, like sort of roots that are coming through the ground. Some more things just to kind of break up the repetition that we have in our terrain. If we look kind of across this path here, which we have rocks that come across the side here, and we disable our misc items, you can see how they really play an important role in kind of breaking up more of the patterns before we add in the rocks. So if we go ahead and enable it, and we kind of look at it without the wireframe, which there's an easier way to kind of hide that without having to click it like that, you can see how it adds a bunch of randomness. And you see these assets right here are the exact same, but the way that you rotate, if you rotate them, you just kind of flip them around, you can see how using the same assets can really help hide a lot of the repetition and just sort of the basic or simplified geometry that we have in our scene. So even though this is the same asset, you can see how they're using it to sort of have these roots come out. If we hide this, we can see that this tree, even though it's just a model, or actually it's part of the terrain, I think. Yeah, this is a part of the terrain, but if I go ahead and find where I disabled it, you can see once we enable it, how they like the roots are sort of positioned to, make it look like it's coming out of the tree. And you can always tweak this. You can take it and move it a little bit if you wanted to. And if I can actually grab the handle, you can kind of move it around a little bit, position it. And that's what's really important about being able to add some variety to our scene here, is that these roots, even though these are the same assets, this one's kind of rotate a little bit, sort of, add some variation. For example, this one, you can't see any, visible roots coming out other than like, if there's some that's supposed to be down under here, but like these ones have it. And if we come over here, a lot of these trees don't really have that, so that's why it's good to be able to add that variation to sort of break up the repetition that we have. So one of the key elements that we have so far is, even though we have the same assets in the same area here, like this is the exact same route in like the same spot within close proximity. By being able to lower this, we can kind of hide a lot of the repetition that we have if we have just the same element in the same area. And by, for example, placing this tree stump here that's fallen over, it sort of helps to kind of hide that too. So that's some more of the miscellaneous stuff that's added. Let's actually start looking at the rocks. And I'm going to show this area that we're in right now, just to kind of see how it changes this seemingly blank looking pathway. So with the rocks enabled, you can see just how much the rocks fill up the scene here. A majority of the geometry in our scene looks like it comes from the rocks. In fact, it takes so much performance just to be able to highlight the our wireframe. That's why I do not recommend you go into wireframe, because you're just going to drop FPS. You can see just how much the rocks actually add to the scene, especially in this area over here. If we kind of let's look at this area, hide some of the rocks. You can see without the rocks that we have that basic terrain. And what I've kind of considered and what I've kind of realized now is that the terrain isn't necessarily to add variation to like where we walk. I mean, it's important where your player is actually able to go, but a lot of the terrain over here is just so that we can have height to our foliage and our elements that we place under the terrain, like the trees and the grass. A lot of the actual geometry that we have that's key is the geometry, like the rocks. You can see how these ones are kind of sticking out, and we still see some of the terrain here, so we don't have just rocks. But you can see how we have both these big rocks and these little ones down here. You see these are kind of placed individually, and these might very possibly be, a couple of these in these areas may very well be this, the same model, but by again rotating them and lowering some of them in the ground, we hide a lot of the repetition if we use the same assets in the same area. So let's kind of look back over here. We can see there's some more rocks down here on the ground, and this is one big model, as you can see here. Let's just kind of pull this one up a little bit, and you can kind of see how we have a lot of height in this one, a lot of height variations. We kind of select away from it. There's a lot of height variations here, but by lowering it into the ground and letting the some of the grass pop out, we really hide a lot of that the mesh down under the ground. But it helps to, it makes it look like these are all individually placed rocks, which helps, blend in the grass really well, because the grass can be placed and the rocks can be, a certain height, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a specific height. You can see no matter where I place these at any height, it still blends in really nice. So if we kind of look at this area over here, these big rock structures, a lot of these are the same assets. Like these two right here are the exact same. But again, the key comes in how you rotate them and position them, and by making some of them, come together like this. If you make them kind of intersect, it kind of hides a lot of the repetitive patterns. And like this one up here is slightly different. And a couple of them are just rotated, and that really helps to hide a lot of that repetition. So as you can see, a lot of these assets are very much the same. Some of them are placed in different areas. But you don't have to have a lot of assets to create a very, random looking scene. A lot of it comes in how you place your assets, and a lot of that detail and the meticulous time it takes to, tweak everything and just kind of play around with your geometry just to kind of make everything blend together. So there's there's pretty much all of the assets that I've walked through. If we go ahead and enable everything back, you can see all of them blend together. And this is, keep in mind, this is without much post-processing. If we disable our, let's go find our scene settings, or our post-processing volume. If we enable or we disable ambient occlusion, a lot of that detail is lost. But again, the variety that we have in how our assets are placed really help to bring a lot of the natural appearance of the scene together. And like I mentioned, a lot of the detail that we have in our scene comes from our post-processing. So I haven't really walked in detail a lot through how our assets are placed in the scene or the post-processing volume specifically, because I have not spent a lot of time myself looking at it. But hopefully this kind of shows you how the assets are placed and sort of give you an idea of how a scene like this was created by layering all these different techniques and assets together to create a very cohesive looking environment. So I hope this video has kind of helped you guys see how Unity has created this very unique and realistic looking environment inside of Unity 2018. And I encourage you guys to get the demo yourself if you haven't. It's amazing that all these assets are included for free, and I believe you can use all these assets commercially for free. You can there's no license restrictions as long as you use it inside of a Unity project. Now, don't go exporting this and using this in Unreal or some 3D rendering application. You need to use these on Unity. But it's crazy that a lot of these assets are free, and Unity actually encourages you to use these assets in your own projects. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I encourage you to mess around with the project and let me know what you think.